There's a bunch of people who just love this cold weather. This year the BBC is working with museums across the country to build a history of the world. The idea is to tell that history with objects. But how can you sum up the East with just one single object? Well, I've been to Colchester to find out. Colchester in Essex. A quick glance suggests it to be much like any other large town. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll see it has one of the richest histories in England. The castle behind me is in the heart of Colchester. It's inside that most of the town's treasures can be found, the most important belonging to a time when the Romans lived here. The Romans first settled in Colchester in 44 AD. They would stay in Britain for 400 years, leaving behind them a rich legacy which shaped the world we live in today. Philip Wise is Heritage Manager for Colchester and Ipswich Museums. Philip's taking me to see one of their star exhibits. This is the oldest tomb of a Roman soldier found in this country. It's important as it tells us a lot about what life was like in those times.
This is the tombstone of a Roman soldier, a man called Longinus Shadapese, and it's one of the earliest and most important representations of a Roman soldier from Roman Britain.
What do we know about him?
Well, we know that Longinus was a duplicarius, which is, in modern terms would have been a sergeant major, and he was second in command of a cavalry unit of about 32 men. He was a professional soldier. He'd come into Britain with the invading Roman army in AD 43, and he'd established a base here in Colchester.
What do we know about Longinus?
We know quite a lot about Longinus. There are details of his armour shown here on the sculpture. We can see details of the horse harness fittings that the horse was decorated with. The inscription here tells us really quite a lot about him. We can see his name, Longinus Shadapese. We're told that his father was a man called Matigus. We know where he came from, a place called Sardica, which is modern Sofia in Bulgaria. We know how long he was in the army, about 25 years. We know his age, he was 40 when he died. Roman soldiers paid into a sort of a savings club, and that purpose of that club was to enable them to have a proper funeral, because the Romans were, at this time in particular, were very concerned about having a proper funeral. So you paid into this club, and then your fellow soldiers made sure that you had a good send-off.
What was life like for Longinus when he would have been here in Colchester, when he was around?
I think it would have been quite tough for Longinus. He was living in a fairly rudimentary wooden barrack building with very little in the way of modern comforts. He would have been living in a fort which had only recently been established, and so it would have been quite tough, really, I think. Tombstone was found in the great Roman Western Cemetery of Colchester along the main road to London, and the reason for that was that under Roman law you weren't allowed to bury people within settlements or fortresses. So Longinus was buried outside the city, and the story of his discovery is really quite remarkable. Most of the tombstone was found in 1926, but certain key pieces, including the face of Longinus, were missing, and those weren't found until 70 years later. And it's really quite remarkable, and we're very fortunate to have been able to put the tombstone back together here in Colchester Castle.
The soldiers would have had a hard time adjusting to our harsh British winters, but that wasn't the only challenge the invaders faced.
Longinus was part of the Roman invasion force which landed on the south coast, and between there and the Thames he would have encountered resistance from tribesmen such as this figure behind me. Once he got into Essex, we think that things quietened down quite a lot, and by the time he arrived here at Camulodunum, the old name for Colchester, the tribesmen had pretty much surrendered, and it was a bit of a pushover, to be honest. So just mind your head here, David, it's a bit low.
So Philip, whereabouts are we now?
We're now standing in a space underneath the modern museum and indeed the Norman castle, David. But this isn't actually Norman, this is Roman. These are the foundations of a Roman temple. When Longinus came here with the invading army, he came to establish Roman rule. And one of the defining characteristics of Roman rule was Roman religion. The temple that was built here was to the deified Emperor Claudius, and it was built shortly after his death in AD 54.
So these are the foundations of that temple?
Yes, and they're a remarkable survival. We can see around us, over here and above our heads, the actual foundations. We can see the building stones of various sorts, and we can see the cement that holds it all together.
The temple didn't last long. Within 7 years, it was destroyed during a fierce battle with warrior Queen Boudica.
It's not just inside the Castle Museum that you'll find Roman remains. Outside, there's over 3,000 metres of the original Roman city wall is still here, and it's in remarkably good condition.
These tiles and bricks would have been made by local tradesmen. Many other relics are housed in the museum, and they show just how sophisticated Roman culture was.
At this period, when Longinus was here, there was very little in the way of native or locally produced pottery. It was all imported, and this particular bowl comes from France, and it would have been used on a dining table with perhaps nuts or olives or something like that.
It's in remarkably good condition, isn't it?
Oh, it's complete. You can't see the join because there isn't one. The reason this one is complete, incidentally, is it's probably come out of a grave and therefore was particularly carefully buried. So often pottery gets broken in the kitchen or the dining room and it gets shoveled up and thrown away on the rubbish heap. But pots like this were deliberately offered to the dead and therefore put into the grave or into the ground complete.
Historians reckon that back in Longinus's time, around 10,000 people lived in Colchester. It was a thriving town, and relics are still being unearthed today. This is the museum's conservation lab.
We're looking at some pieces of horse harness that are very similar to the ones we saw on Longinus's tomb earlier today. And Emma here is working on cleaning them up and making them ready for display.
I have to say, it's pretty tricky work, Emma. You've got the scalpel there. What are you doing?
What I'm actually having to do is remove very carefully the sort of corrosion layer and the burial soil just from the surface to actually reveal what was a very fine silver-plated piece of bronze.
Now that work there, the carvings on it are incredible. So by using the scalpel, that's the only way you can preserve it, is it? That's the only way you can get to them?
Well, working with magnification, either with a magnifier or with a microscope, it worked with sort of pins, scalpels, very fine brushes, and just very painstakingly remove every single bit of green.
You've got a pretty difficult job. Where were these found?
Well, they were found by two metal detectorists about 6 years ago at a small village called Holbrook, just south of Ipswich, in a field. And what's remarkable is that all these pieces were found together, and we actually have a complete set. And that's very, very rare. There's only one other that I'm aware of from the Roman Empire that is a complete set.
This is a great find then.
It's absolutely fantastic, yes. We were really excited when this became available to us.
Even though Longinus died 2,000 years ago, the impact of the Romans played a big part in developing the world as we know it today.
And if you have an object which shows what the people or places of the UK have given to the world, you can add it to our digital museum so you can help us tell a history of the world. To find out more, go to bbc.co.uk/a history of the world. Well, that's it from Ramsey in Cambridgeshire. Snow's coming down again. See you next week for some more surprising stories.
Next week, Robert Foster and Aaron McClure died in Afghanistan fighting for their country. Aaron's name is on his town's local war memorial. So why is Robert's name left off his?
I don't think we're asking for the world.